Johnson controlled, when he was in the Senate, he controlled the Senate, he controlled the House of Representatives. Very powerful person. And his theory was he would help someone do whatever they wanted to do as long as he got his cut, and it was normally 10%. And that was in cash, never in a check. And Madeline also said that during that time in Dallas, if you wanted someone beat up, it might cost you $5 or $10. If you wanted them killed, it might cost as high as $100. And nobody would investigate it, and they just ought to be killed. That's just where it was. Now, Johnson's lawyer, John Coffer, represented Johnson at the famous Box 13 investigation, where the first office for federal government position that Johnson ran for was for Congress. And in Duval County, all the votes were in Johnson's favor, and except in Box 13 contained the votes that would have made Johnson lose, which would have made him lose that election. And for some reason, that Box 13 disappeared, never to be found. Madeline asked Lyndon one day, he says, Lyndon, what was in Box 13? And he said, Madeline, it's the same thing that's going to be in the records of JFK assassination. There's nothing in those records. And the record's supposed to be released about the year 2037 or something like that. But Coffer represented Johnson in the Box 13 scandal. He also represented Billy Saul Estes when Billy Saul had a bunch of fertilizer tanks. And he thought it would be neat to mortgage those tanks. In fact, he would take one tank and mortgage it with maybe 10 or 15 different banks. And got caught and went to trial. But he was kicking back to Johnson. And Coffer was there to make sure that Johnson's name did not come up and that Billy Saul went to prison without uttering the name Johnson. Billy did go to prison, but John Coffer represented him and made sure he pled guilty. Now, Billy Saul's daughter, Pamela, wrote a book titled Billy Saul. And in that book, she said, most people, when they're going to trial, they want to make sure that they have an impartial jury. What they really ought to be concerned with is that they go to trial where there's an impartial judge. Because you can take an impartial jury and the judge can swing that jury any way they want to, and they readily do that. John Coffer also represented Mac Wallace when he killed John Douglas Kinser. And that's how Mac got off so quickly. Now let's talk about President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. He was shot at 12:30 p.m. November 22nd, 1963 at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. The accused assassin by the Warren Commission was Lee Harvey Oswald, the sole shooter. Supposedly fired 3 shots from the southeast corner of the Texas School Book Depository building on the 6th floor, and was supposedly the only shot. Actually, there was a 15-person death squad made up of 1 woman and 14 men. Behind the picket fence at Grassy Knoll, there were 2 shooters and 1 man on a walkie-talkie radio. One of the shooters behind the Grassy Knoll, as he was following the car, didn't notice the street sign, and when he pulled the trigger, it was lined up with a street sign, and it hit that street sign and ricocheted off. The other fired a shot that blew the top of Kennedy's head off from the Grassy Knoll. On the 6th floor, there were 3 men and 1 lady. The lady was a Hispanic lady about the age of 20. She was manning a radio. She had gone to Fort Worth to pick up an Indian who lived in Oklahoma City, east of Oklahoma City, and drove him down there because Mac Wallace had met him at a funeral for one of the congressmen that had died, and said that he may need his talents later. And so on the 6th floor there was Mac Wallace. His job was to shoot and kill Governor John Connally. The Indian was to shoot Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald was on the 6th floor at the time of the shooting, but I'm convinced that he was directly under CIA mind control, and that they had fired the 3 shells out on a target range somewhere or just out in the woods, and had the 3 empty shell cases laying on the floor, had the rifle laying on the floor, and that Oswald was probably waiting over by the staircase. Just as soon as they started shooting, his job was to run down the steps and wait on the 2nd floor, get him a Coke, and just stand there. Because now, if you recall, in the Olympics in Australia this year, that I believe the fellow was named Green, that was the fastest man in the world. He ran the 100-meter dash. When he completed the event, and he was way ahead of the 2nd fastest guy, he just trotted over to the TV camera and started talking to the reporter. Wasn't breathing hard, didn't seem to be sweating. He just was carrying on a normal conversation. He just finished the race of his life and did not show any signs that he'd just done that. Under hypnosis, you can create the same effect. You could have a person run down the steps to the 2nd floor, to the employee lounge, and as the shots were fired, there's a motorcycle patrolman thought the shots came from the top of the building, so he parked his bike real quick, ran up the steps, and just as soon as he entered the building, he met the building manager. They started running up the steps, and when they got to the 2nd floor, they saw Lee Harvey Oswald in front of the Coke machine drinking a Coke in the employee lounge. Well, he wasn't breathing hard. He was just standing there casually, and so they ran on up, and so that was the last they saw of Lee Harvey Oswald until he casually just walked out of the building. Now, on the 2nd floor of the Dowtex building, behind the motorcade, there was 1 shooter and 1 radio operator. And on the top of the Dallas County Records building, there was 1 shooter and 1 radio operator. The shooter on the top of this Records building happened to be a crack shot and was a member of the Dallas County Sheriff's Department. He was a deputy sheriff. He wasn't there to protect the president, but to help kill him. Okay, now on the 2nd floor of the Texas School Book Depository building was the command post. There were 4 men on the 2nd floor in a closed room. One of them was Cliff Carter. He was manning the radio. He gave the orders to fire. Now, as the cars were going down the street, Lyndon Johnson was in a car 3 or 4 cars back behind JFK. Now, Ralph Yarborough was in that same car, and he told a friend of mine that he saw Lyndon up against the window, had a walkie-talkie up against his ear, listening to something. Well, he was listening for Cliff Carter to say, "Shoot." And within about 4 seconds time, 7 shots were fired. One of them, as I said earlier, blew the top of Kennedy's head off. Another one hit him in the back of the neck, came out his bow tie at a knot. Another shot from Mac Wallace went through Governor Connally's shoulder, through his thigh, and lay down on the ground of the car. In my book, I give you the names of all those shooters, exactly where they were standing, and a brief history of all those people. The only person still alive of that 15-person death squad is Ruth Ann, unless the elite have had her killed. And she's the only human being that can tell us whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald even had a gun in his hand that day. And I've recommended in the book that the Justice Department and the Dallas County DA and the Governor of Texas issue a notice to the public that anyone who has direct knowledge of those 3 killings, if they will come forward, they'll give them absolute immunity from prosecution. And that if anyone is in prison or who has ever been in prison has full knowledge and will testify in these deaths, that they will be given a pardon. And so far I haven't convinced the governor to do that. But there are probably at least a dozen people that are still alive that can testify in these cases. Now, the night before JFK was killed, there was a meeting at one of the wealthiest persons in the world's home in North Dallas. His name was Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison went into a lot of deals with a fellow named Sid Richardson, and they bought up a bunch of racetracks. They owned construction companies, oil businesses, all sorts of things. And one day they bought out one of the big railroads up in the east, and next morning one of them called in and said, "By the way, what was the name of that railroad we bought yesterday?" And they were very casual about their investments. But the meeting was at Clint's home. By then, Sid Richardson had died, so he was not there. The social event was supposed to be in behalf of J. Edgar Hoover, who was in town, and they were there to honor him. And so J. Edgar Hoover was there. The event started at 8 o'clock in the evening. Madeline Brown was there, the author of Texas in the Morning, and since she's become a dear friend of mine. She was Lyndon Johnson's mistress for 21 years, and he was, wherever he was scheduled to be, she was also invited. So she was invited to Clint Murchison's event. And about 9 o'clock, the front door opened, and Lyndon walked in and said, "Okay, men, it's time for our meeting." And 25 men got up and walked into the dining room. They closed the door. And now, I have 4 sources of this information that are still alive. One of those sources is a mafia associate that I told you earlier, when I need something, there it is. This person contacted me and said, I've heard about you, and I understand that you're a very honest person and that you're trying to collect information. And I know all about the JFK killing, and if you will keep my name private, I'll tell it all. And so I guaranteed that name will never be known. But this person was in the Clint Murchison meeting. He was also on the second floor of the Texas School Book Depository building when JFK was shot. So he's an eyewitness to both events. Madeline was there. She told me in her book, she gives a couple of names of the people that were at that event. And right after I met her, someone sent me a copy of her book and said they're looking for an investor. And I read it, and I said I'd like to. I'm interested in it. So I became a distributor of that book, and I wanted to meet the author, so I went to Dallas and met her, and so we had several discussions on it, and we became close friends. And so as time went on, she finally one day she said, "Gaylon, I've known you long enough now that I know I can trust you, so I'm going to tell it all." And so she told all about the Clint Murchison event, and I have it on video, and probably sometime next month I'll make that video available. But other than the shooters I've talked about, the there were at least a half dozen other killers in Dallas, and they were probably downstream from the Dealey Plaza and